Learn English through story. Whispers of a lover. In the heart of an ancient city where history's shadows lay along across narrow streets, there stood an aging mansion that overlooked the busy world below. It had been there for centuries. A crumbling monument to forgotten grandeur. Inside, it housed Adrian, a man of quiet wealth and even quieter demeanor. He was in his mid-40s, a successful scholar of history, and his life had long been dictated by the routine of his work. Books and manuscripts had become his faithful companions, while human interaction had dwindled to polite, distant exchanges. His home, though beautiful in its own right, had become a lonely prison where silence reigned. Adrian had never married. His early affairs, brief and unremarkable, had faded with time, leaving him with little desire for the complications of love. He had always considered himself a man content with solitude. That is, until he met her. Her name was Leila, a woman unlike any he had ever known. They crossed paths one evening at an art exhibition, where she had been studying a painting as if it contained some hidden truth. There was a sadness in her eyes that caught Adrian's attention immediately, a deep melancholy that mirrored his own quiet isolation. Drawn to her without understanding why, he found himself beside her before he could stop himself. "That's one of my favorites," he said, referring to the piece she was admiring, a haunting depiction of an ancient lover's betrayal. Leila turned toward him, her gaze soft yet intense, and for a moment, Adrian felt the world fall away. She was stunning, but not in the obvious way. There was a quiet, understated beauty about her dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the gallery. "It speaks to me," she said, her voice low, as if the two of them were sharing a secret. "There's something about it'll broken bar the loneliness." Adrian nodded, feeling an unspoken understanding pass between them. They spent the rest of the evening talking, not just about art but about life, their shared love of history, and the strange sadness they both carried. There was something about Leila that captivated Adrian. She had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a confession, as if she were baring her soul, but in whispers only he could hear. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers, and from that moment on, their lives became intertwined. Leila, as Adrian soon discovered, was a writer. She specialized in tragic romances, weaving tales of unrequited love, betrayal, and longing. Her work was poetic and filled with raw emotion, and as Adrian grew closer to her, he began to see pieces of her in her stories. She was a woman who had been wounded by life, someone who had loved deeply and lost. Their relationship blossomed quickly. They were both drawn to the quiet spaces they found in each other, the shared silences where words weren't needed. Leila moved into Adrian's mansion within months, and for the first time in years, his home felt alive. Her presence transformed the space. The cold, empty rooms were filled with warmth, with laughter, with whispers in the night. But as the months passed, Adrian began to notice something strange about Leila. She was elusive, disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. When he asked her where she had been, she would smile, brush it off, and change the subject. At night, he would sometimes wake to find her standing at the window, staring out into the darkness as if waiting for something. When he asked her what was wrong, she would always give the same answer: "Nothing, Adrian. Go back to sleep." Despite the growing sense of unease, Adrian found himself falling deeper in love with her. There was a mystery to Leila that he couldn't unravel, but it only made him more desperate to understand her, to save her from whatever darkness haunted her. He began to lose himself in her, abandoning his work and isolating himself from the world, consumed by the intensity of their connection. One night, As they lay together in the dark, Leela turned to him, her face inches from his. Do you ever feel like there's something missing, Adrian? She whispered. Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable, and it sent a shiver down his spine. What do you mean? He asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Like a broken bar you're living half a life, like something was taken from you before you even knew it was yours. Adrian stared at her, confused by the sudden change in her tone. He had never thought of his life in those terms. No, he said after a pause, I don't think I've ever felt that way. Leela sighed and turned away from him, her voice barely audible as she said, I have, every day. Adrian reached out, pulling her close. What's wrong, Leela? You can tell me. She shook her head, her hair brushing against his chest. It's nothing. I'm just a broken bar tired. But Adrian knew better. He could sense that something was wrong, that Leela was keeping secrets from him, and the more she withdrew, the more desperate he became to understand her. Days turned into weeks, and Leela's strange behavior only intensified. She would often vanish for hours, returning home with no explanation, her mood darker and more distant each time. Adrian began to fear that she was hiding something from him, something that could tear them apart. One evening, unable to bear the secrecy any longer, Adrian followed her. He waited until she left the house and trailed her through the winding streets of the city, keeping his distance. She moved quickly, her head down, her steps purposeful. As she walked, Adrian's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and anticipation flooding his veins. Leela led him to an old, abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the city. Adrian watched as she slipped inside, her movements fluid and graceful. He waited for a moment before following her, his footsteps quiet on the stone path. The inside of the chapel was dark and musty, the air thick with a scent of decay. He could hear the faint sound of whispers coming from the back of the room, and as he crept closer, he saw Leela standing before a crumbling altar, her hands raised in supplication. She was not alone. A man stood beside her, tall and imposing, his features hidden in the shadows. He spoke to her in a low voice, his words too quiet for Adrian to hear, but there was an intimacy in the way they stood together, an unmistakable closeness that sent a surge of jealousy through Adrian's heart. He stepped forward, his voice trembling with rage. Leela. Leela spun around, her eyes wide with shock. The man beside her stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as if he had never been there at all. Adrian, Leela whispered, her voice laced with guilt. What are you doing here? I should ask you the same thing, Adrian said, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. Who was that? What is this? Leela lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It's not what you think, she said softly. Please, let me explain. Adrian's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had trusted her, had given her everything, and now he felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling away. You've been lying to me, he said, his voice breaking. This whole time. No, Leela said, stepping toward him. I haven't been lying. I just a broken bar. I couldn't tell you. I didn't know how. Tell me what? Adrian demanded, his voice rising in frustration. Leela hesitated, her eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. There's someone else, she said finally, her voice barely audible. But it's not what you think. Adrian's heart shattered in that moment. He had suspected it, of course, but hearing the words from her lips was a wound that cut deeper than he could have imagined. Who is he? He asked, his voice hoarse. Leela shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Has a broken bar. He's not real, Adrian. He's a memory, a ghost. Adrian stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Leela took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I loved someone once. Before I met you, he died, tragically. And I've never been able to let go. In a broken bar I come here to talk to him, to feel close to him. It's the only way I know how to deal with the pain." Adrian stood frozen, his mind reeling. A ghost, a memory, none of it made sense. And yet, as he looked into her tear-filled eyes, he realized the truth of her words. She had been living with a ghost, haunted by a love that had died long ago. And no matter how much he loved her, he could never fill that void. "I'm sorry," Leela whispered, stepping closer to him. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for you to find out like this. But I can't let go of him, Adrian. I've tried, but I can't." Adrian's heart ached as he looked at her, torn between love and heartbreak. He had fallen in love with Leela, but he had been blind to the fact that she was still in love with someone else, a man who no longer existed in this world. And in that moment, he realized that no matter how much he wanted to save her, to pull her out of the darkness, some things were beyond saving. "I love you, Adrian," Leela said, her voice breaking. "But I can't be the woman you need me to be. I'm sorry." Adrian closed his eyes, his chest tightening with pain. He wanted to hold her, to tell her that it would be okay, but he knew that it wouldn't. Some loves were too broken to fix, too lost in the whispers of the past. Without another word, Adrian turned and walked away, leaving Leela behind in the shadows of the chapel, alone with her ghost. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoyed, then please like and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.